וגם הדוברת הבאה שלנו אינה עובדת מדינה בשלב הזה, גברת סינה ביגלי, מנהלת שותפה במרכז מדיניות הסייבר והמודיעין וחוקרת בחירה למדיניות וביטחון בתאגיד רנד. לפני כן היא שירתה למעלה מעשור בממשלת ארצות הברית, גם במועצה לביטחון לאומי, גם במרכז הלאומי למלחמה בטרור, גם במשרד שר ההגנה, והוצבה בעיראק כחלק מכוח המשימה המשותף לתמיכה במבצעים Enduring Freedom ו-Iraqi Freedom. בבקשה, סינה.
Hello, and thank you for having me here today, all the way out from California in the United States. So it's a pleasure to join you to discuss this really very important topic, both to my organization, my current organization, RAND Corporation, but really anyone who cares about truth and facts, and in my case, in particular, national security. So I'm speaking to you today both as a RAND researcher and manager, but also, as Vera pointed out, as a former national security official and intelligence officer who, again, relied on information and facts and accurate information, at least we hope so, to inform most of our decision making. So with that said, we now find ourselves in a world where data breaches, data leaks, and data manipulation in particular is quickly becoming the norm. So how does a government operate and provide adequate national security in that environment? A key question we're all facing. Data breach examples, you have consumer data, medical data, employee data, email and personal data, and one I am quite familiar with, information and data about national security officers, personnel data, security clearance information in the United States in 2015 was compromised for more than 20 million of our national security officers. So big vulnerability there, on one hand, just of information, but two, what can be done with that information? How can that information be manipulated, whether it's in an online public aspect, social media, or potential counterintelligence concern? Data leak examples, there are a number throughout the world you hear over time, but one in particular, depending on where you sit or where you stand, you may feel differently about it, but the Snowden example, right? An insider threat, leaking information from the inside, again, providing vulnerability to information, to national security, and ultimately potential access points to get into our information sphere and our information processing and ultimately a decision-making loop. And then finally, data manipulation and disinformation. That is certainly the topic of the day, whether you're talking about Brexit, the 2016 US election interference, use of bots to disseminate false information, reports and concerns about deep fakes and what that might mean, and how that might affect permanent decision-making and potentially have fatal results. And then just fake news intended to influence or reach a political gain. So in this data insecure world, I was recently asked, do we now find ourselves in a post-privacy and maybe even a post-data security era, right? Where we assume everything is compromised, that some entity somewhere knows something or everything about us, and we don't want them to know that. I suspect no, we're not there yet, but increasingly it is difficult to ensure the security of our information, especially if it's stored anywhere online, but also within the reach of a potential insider. So we are still in a fairly data insecure era, and as we've been discussing, we are also in a facts and truth challenged era where securing the integrity of those facts and the value of objective analysis is increasingly difficult. So how do we now secure data from manipulation or outright falsehoods that are treated as facts, alternative or otherwise, by actors with a specific motivation, be it geopolitical, partisan, or just to reaffirm a worldview? Earlier you saw a video about the RAND Corporation Truth Decay study. We have also studied this particular issue from a few different other angles that have looked at online disinformation campaigns, 2016 election being one of them, by nefarious actors, the use of cyber coercion as well. And very recently, some of our researchers also came out with a study specifically on this very topic of manipulation. So this was the emerging risk of virtual societal warfare. That's what they're calling it. Social manipulation in a changing information environment. So specifically, this looked at cyber aggression. That involves efforts to manipulate or disrupt the information foundations of a functioning economic and social system. And some of what it found was, one, that national security will increasingly rely on and necessitate a resilient information environment. I think we can all kind of feel that and recognize that. That means traditional information and cybersecurity, protecting against the data leaks and the data insecurity on one hand, but strong mediating actions, so government and private, and a population that's continuously inoculated against the evolving techniques of social manipulation. But of course, it's how to accomplish that inoculation that becomes such a challenge moving forward. Also, the barrier between public and private endeavors and their responsibilities in this space. This was touched on just before this in the discussion with the previous Minister of Justice. But looking at that, the responsibilities in this space of private entities, social media entities, Facebook and others, in handling sort of facts information, propagating potential information that could have significant results on an election, but could also have significant results on decision making if facts are overtaken by perception and social media dissemination. So national security will require increasingly to have that cooperation and ensure due diligence of private companies in this area, since it's not in the capability of individual nation states to control all information transmitted on these platforms by these transnational online companies. They don't fall sort of within any one purview. And so it creates a real challenge. Finally, attribution will be increasingly difficult as actors, especially nation-state actors, strengthen their capabilities in this area to be more effective, but also to protect themselves against identification and retaliation using a global network that's difficult to detect and even more difficult to counter. So as governments and institutions and just responsible, concerned actors and citizens of the world, where does that leave us and what can be done? Well, there are a few actions that can be taken. None are going to solve all the problems. One is getting ahead of technology and just thinking about how it can be used for this very purpose, this idea of manipulation and cognitive warfare, however you want to kind of couch it, but the idea that information is being weaponized for particular political purposes and disseminated in a way that's so quick, you don't realize the message that's out there until it's too late or it's influencing decision making. And this is a world, as we start facing artificial intelligence, the evolution of quantum computing, an ever-changing, rapidly sort of technological evolving environment. Some of this may come naturally as in being able to kind of get ahead of the technological curve or think about where it's going. As decision makers become better versed in technologies, right? So you can call this, we talk about media literacy, this is technology literacy. And you have decision makers making decisions about national security, not necessarily having the full picture or really even an understanding of how that technology works and the risks that it may present to the nation over time. So some of this may be remedied eventually as these decision maker positions are filled with native technology users. They just inherently kind of understand how the technology works and what it might mean, but that will take quite a long time. So even with the increased literacy, which can take time, there will always be the challenge of capabilities outpacing government and society's abilities to defend against them and potentially even thinking creatively about how they might be used. Another action, communicating regularly with, and in some cases partnering with, private organizations that have a role and an interest in this space. So some of these social media giants are certainly some of those. I think we've seen that splashed across the news, where there is sometimes mutual interest. So it may be geopolitical on the part of a nation state, but potentially and likely financial in the case of these private entities. Yes, there's social good that some of them espouse and want to do, but in the end, there's a bottom line. They are private organizations that are ultimately for-profit organizations. So understanding what that mutual interest is and working together to secure this space to the extent that it can. But understanding also that there are tensions that are inherently there between the private sector and the government in this space. There have been, there will be. Some of this is historical, so trust issues, right, vis-a-vis, for instance, the Snowden disclosures, kind of concerns about where the government goes too far or potentially sort of invading what is seen as sort of a space controlled by the private sector or these entities believe should be protected. But also regulatory roles of government. And there's always that tension where most of these organizations and institutions aren't seeking out that regulation. Occasionally, they'll say, can you help us here and give us some guidance? But most of the time, there's a tension between government seeking out regulation to kind of control and the private sector obviously not wanting the shackles on, not controlling both their freedom of action, but also their freedom of profit making. And so what this can't mean is dictating what must be done from the government side to the private sector side. There does have to be that conversation because ultimately many of the actions that will be taken in this social virtual warfare are not actions that the government will be able to take directly, but we'll need to partner with the entities that actually control where the information is being housed. And then this leads me to my last point. As practitioners and policymakers and researchers and just as concerned citizens here in the audience, we are taking important steps in solution building right here today by having these conversations about facts and truth and analysis and what role that plays in society. And by beginning discussions internationally across cultures about what norms, what values we hold that we have in common, where there are red lines, where something goes too far, when a nation state shouldn't have a particular action or space. When a bad actor has gone too far, what should be done about it when they do, both from a retaliation perspective and any future deterrent value that can be taken in response. And then how we can help inoculate populations from nefarious manipulation. So education, regulation, et cetera. What are the tools we have in our toolkit to help provide for national security, as governments are charged with doing, while still maintaining the free exchange of ideas and speech that is just foundational for democratic institutions and societies. So I certainly don't have all the answers or a panacea solution to this, but as a former national security official and now as a researcher and concerned citizen, I'm very glad we're having these conversations. I truly hope they'll be given priority. They are due internal to our governments. Because the threat is not going to go away. It'll come again in another form or another manifestation, perhaps less obvious and less detectable as technology evolves. So the better prepared we are to deal with this challenge and in some cases this threat, both now and as it evolves, the safer we will be. So thank you for having me today. I appreciate it.